Better? Great. Excellent. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to be here with you in Delhi again at this year's Raisina Dialogue. You are most welcome. As all of you know, this conversation is on the overall topic of tech accountability. Basu has done me a good service already. He has introduced our wonderful panel of experts. So I won't go through each bio for you. But what I will say is that we have a range of expertise. As you will have heard from Basu, our experts come from various disciplines. We have experts from strategic advisors to government, regulatory bodies, industry, and research. We also have expertise from various jurisdictions and regions. We have naturally expertise from here in India, the Middle East, the United States, and of course Europe. So I'm really looking forward to a very global feel to this conversation. In practical terms, many of you are delegates that have been to Raisina on many occasions, and these dinner sessions are very short. They're only 50 minutes long. So what I want to do is just go straight into a deep dive, straight into the driving questions that have been provided to us by ORF, and then open up to each of you so that we can keep the conversation alive and high energy. I spoke very briefly, or rather some of our panelists were speaking to some of their thoughts before we started, and I think they're certainly geared up for this late night session. So with that, I think I would like to begin with Stephanie. Stephanie is going to provide a sense of where we are at in 2024, so a sense of a lie of the land. And with that, Stephanie, what I'd love to hear from you is what's actually new relating to the delivery of public goods. So over to you.
Thank you. So I just want to kick this off by thinking about what is actually going on. So I think this panel is sort of framed around this sort of tension between, on one side, innovation, and on the other side, accountability to citizens. And I guess I want to problematize that and actually think about, well, what is going on? Is that the right way to think about that? So public goods, in a sense, are things in society that are sort of generally for public interest. They are the things that we need for society to run. And I think what's interesting about this panel is that what isn't new is the provision of these by the private sector. There's not anything in the idea of public goods that means that they are provided by the state. So that is not new. We've never really had a situation where everywhere, in many cases, all public goods were provided by the state. So that's not what's going on here that's new. What is going on that's new with digital technology is the idea that we now have digital spaces, digital platforms, digital infrastructure being necessary for access to public goods. So it's becoming the infrastructure through which other public goods are being provided. And it's also changing what it looks like to receive or experience public goods. So what it means to engage in politics, to have civic engagement, to access knowledge, that looks very different now. And so therefore that's causing us to think differently about what it means to actually live and act and be a citizen. It's taking place increasingly in a digital realm. And that gives it this, that in itself seems a bit unprecedented. So I want to point out two areas where this provision of public goods through a digital realm might be being threatened. And on one side, we might think of it as coming from the private sector, specifically the idea that we're having large companies based often in a very few number of countries, mostly the US and China, being the basis for a lot of technology globally. And so you get countries around the world being dependent on firms that are based outside their borders and are being subject to regulation outside their borders as well. And that sort of tension, I think, is potentially new, and it's also not going anywhere. I think, was it last week that Sam Altman announced that he wants to raise £7 trillion or $7 trillion for a new chip. That type of money is not going to be accessible in all countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So we need to think this idea of monopoly is not really going anywhere. And that is a challenge, and that is something that's new. The other side, though, is we're also seeing threats to the provision of public goods through digital channels, also from our politicians and from governments themselves. We're seeing a huge rise in the amount of shutdowns. The ability to use disinformation is useful in elections. That's been, I think, a theme of this week as well, too, as we're thinking ahead to what this year is going to look like. So the threat is not just private, it's not just public, it's both. And so given that then, I want to just touch briefly on how we might think about what needs to change. How can we manage this changing space, this changing global environments, having implications on the provision of public goods at a national level? And I want to just, is not going to be in the space of saying just more regulation by the states, especially not if states are potentially part of the problem and are preventing access to public goods. And in a sense, I want to sort of point to three things that I think we need to be thinking about if we want to sort of take seriously what it would look like to ensure inclusive access to public goods going on into an increasingly digital world. First, and I'll touch briefly just because I know we don't have a lot of time. First one, we need to think about sort of addressing knowledge silos. So to address these sort of issues in the digital realm, we need to have increased technical knowledge. It doesn't necessarily exist in government, but we also need understanding of the ethics and we need understanding of politics. And I think that those three types of knowledge need to be put together and need to be given probably equal importance if we want to be thinking about this seriously. Second, as I mentioned, we need to move away from thinking about who owns the spaces that public goods are provided and to think instead about what's the conditions of a context that is enabling of public goods that are inclusive, accessible, open, trusting. And that's a different way to frame it. So it doesn't mean that it's private versus private is bad, state is good, but what are the conditions of different relationships that make that positive or negative? And then the last one, I think we need to be thinking about who needs to be involved in these conversations and on what basis of legitimacy. On one side, this is global. We're sort of seeing the delivery of public goods through global infrastructure, but one that has national foundations. What would it look like to have the globally affected in this conversation and not just centered in the US or in China? And second, we've seen where digital infrastructure has been developed in a way that takes into account public goods. There's often been a key role for civil society. What does that then look like as well? And how can we do that in a meaningful way? I'll stop with that.
Feeling I'll be doing that quite a bit. That's fabulous. Thank you so much, Stephanie. It's also a great segue, Vivek. I might pass the floor to you with the view to either hearing your thoughts on that specific question and Stephanie's outline, but also given the overarching conversation on this balance between innovation and regulatory solutions, how you view these questions. So over to you, Vivek.
Thank you and good evening, everyone. The issues, I think, are simple enough, and everyone present in this room is familiar with those issues. That does not necessarily mean that the answers to those issues or the answers to those questions are simple in any fashion. We use the expression public goods. When we use the expression public goods, we ought to be a little bit careful because they aren't quite necessarily public goods in the sense that economists have classically used that expression public goods. It isn't necessarily true that there are externalities or market failures either. I say this particularly because this is happening in India, and in India you know that one of our success stories in terms of interventions has been digital public infrastructure and the various facets of digital public infrastructure, which raises a different kind of issue that we are not talking about here today, and that is a conflict between a regulator and a provider. In principle, such a conflict can always exist if the public sector delivers something like this. The more serious issue is the issue that was earlier flagged, which is a generic issue, but it assumes particular significance given the themes we are talking about, which is not per se the need for regulation. Everyone agrees that regulation is needed. The problem is really the content of that regulation, on which I don't think we will generally get agreement. Because the problem with any regulator is ex ante. You do not know what the consequences will be of a certain kind of technology, nor do you know what will be the consequences of a certain kind of regulation. As a regulator, you are generally ignorant about what that technology will lead to, and do remember that technology is not necessarily emanating in a market that is characterized by perfect competition. It is emanating from a few selected private players who can influence the determination of standards, and therefore, independent of the regulatory content, there is always the prospect of existing players ensuring and manipulating standards so that future competition and future technology is eliminated and weeded out. So as a regulator, I don't know the technology. Ex ante, I can talk about all kinds of things, fancy expressions, regulatory sandboxes, co-regulation, all kinds of stuff. But much of this is wisdom after the horse has bolted, it is ex post. And this essentially is the problem, and this assumes an even more serious dimension, an even more serious dimension because of what has been mentioned, that it is not happening only within borders. It has a cross-border element, and if it has a cross-border element, that raises two kinds of issues. One, it raises security issues, three kinds of issues, security issues. Secondly, enforceability issues. And thirdly, whether you will ever get agreement on what common standards are. And we know from the jurisprudence on competition policy and regulation that jurisprudence can differ. The US has one kind of view in general, the EU has another one, and in Asia a different kind of jurisprudence is emerging. So it is very difficult to have something like a global consensus, even in terms of minimum standards. So those would be my general comments. Thank you.
That's wonderful, thank you. And I think it leads very well into where I think Basant would like to speak to us with respect to the nature of global regulation, or whether it's even possible and whether we need it. Specifically when we're dealing with a situation where technologies can be geographically unbounded in nature, and of course we have corporates that operate in a global manner. So Basant, I know you have prepared some of your own thoughts, and you might also like the idea of speaking to some of Vivek's points as they relate very specifically to your intervention. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Katrina. I'm very pleased to be here at Rosina. This is my first time, so I'm very excited. I'm very excited to be among stellar of experts here. And I actually second everything that Vivek said about how it's not a simple issue anymore. It's not about a conflict between states and companies, and it is a symbiotic relationship, and it's difficult to reach a consensus regarding a global tech regulation. So regarding this part of tech regulation, it has been approached so far on national or regional levels, and everyone is saying that it's important to have a harmonization between these regulations in terms of that all of them will be pointing at the same kind of practices and standards, and have a common understanding of what could be or should be an appropriate, balanced, and inclusive technological regulation. Because right now, as Vivek said, we live in a world that is globally, digitally interconnected, also in which technological threats are also transnational. And a lot of people would say, okay, if we can't control it nationally, then why not take it globally? Why not have a global tech regulation? And I would say also, as Vivek said, it's not as simple as this. And I would probably say it's a naive take on the issue, because this actually ignores major challenges in having a consensus a global consensus on having a tech regulation. And second, they ignore some worries regarding what kind of tech regulation that will end up if a consensus is reached, given the current political, economic, international, institutional structures that we live in. So developing a global consensus on tech regulation between states and between states, tech companies, and civil society actors is still a challenge issue. We have this symbiotic relationship. It's not a zero-sum relationship between all parties, and we see that in the same manner that technology is dual use, it might do good and it might do harm, there is also a duality where, regarding tech companies, to influence state sovereignty in terms of weakening state sovereignty or actually strengthening state sovereignty at the same time. So on one hand, we see that state sovereignty and control is influenced by technological companies in domains like social mobilization online, espionage, data control from social applications, from the 5G technologies and the Internet of Things. For example, when certain governments tried to block internet during protests, it was Twitter and Google who actually launched a voice-to-text software that allows protesters to communicate without the internet. Here, it's actually a threat to the state control over their societies. Okay? But on the other hand, we can see that there is still a dependency from states on these technological companies to provide them with the technology needed for their competitive digital economy, for their resilient infrastructure, to have cybersecurity, to have an artificial intelligence, to acquire artificial intelligence for their urban safety and for security purposes. So, for example, we have like companies, states, they are relying on Chinese technology and providing them with unconditional artificial intelligence, facial recognition, surveillance softwares that is needed for them in their urban safety and to control their urban environments. So I would say that also at the same time, we can see that the states, they rely on these tech companies in their political elections. Recently, we've seen that Twitter, for example, have been seen as or portrayed as the villain in the US for certain security and political concerns. And all of a sudden, we see that it's hosting Biden's political campaign posts on its platform because of its wide reach among young people. The other aspect is that I want to mention is that one of the most controversial aspects and disputed aspects when it comes to international tech governance is the use and sale of AI and cyber surveillance software by states provided to them by what we call the access as a service companies. And this is actually very problematic because it raises the question around the democratic versus authoritarian approaches to tech governance in general or the ICT governance in general. All of these issues actually present a constraint regarding reaching a consensus when it comes to global tech regulation. And we see a lot of states, they are actually trying to avoid this conversation on the international level when it comes to what is a proper tech regulation, and they prefer to rely only on their national or regional aspects of it. For example, the latest UN ad hoc committee to discuss a regulation regarding the use of the ICT, we can see that it was highly politicized and there was many divisions between those who wants to have a wider or a broader scope of regulation with limited human rights safeguards, and the other group which wants the total opposite. Instead of actually talking about or discussing how can we have a tech regulation that actually complies or actually make this companies responsible for producing a secure by design products. And this is actually what we need in tech regulation. So for these considerations, I would say that I'm not against or I'm not completely rejecting the idea of having a global tech regulation, but I would say that it's very highly unlikely to happen in the short term. And if it happened, we might end up with a very concerning kind of global tech regulation. And this is my take on it.
Thank you very much, Basant. I might jump one over, Sunil, if you don't mind, and hear from Brendan. Brendan, you're working at the coalface of some of these regulatory type decisions and also traveling the whole way from the United States. It's always good to receive your perspective. What are your thoughts, not only on some of the commentary that you've heard, but also on this potential for global coalitions, global initiatives that can balance out some of these concerns relating to innovation, sovereignty, and so on and so forth? Would you mind speaking to some of those aspects?
Thank you so much, and it's wonderful to be here in India. This is actually my first visit to India. I've had a wonderful couple of days. I've had some really good, productive meetings with some of my regulatory counterparts here in the government of India, and not surprisingly, one of the things that I want to talk about here is an area where India has really and truly led the world, and led the world in a way that helps build a global coalition. And one of the things that India has done, as it has seen very, very clearly the threat posed by communist China and how they're trying to use technology to export their authoritarianism and their control. And one area where we see that play out, of course, is technology. We've taken action in the US, so has India, at what we call the device layer, which is looking at technology like Huawei and ZTE, where we found in the US, based on our analysis, that gear was effectively operating as spy gear. We took action in the US as well at the carrier level. So we took action on China Mobile and China Telecom based on our examination of data flows. So for instance, in one instance, we found data traffic that was originating in, I believe, San Francisco, California. It was destined for Washington, D.C., and yet it was routed through Guangzhou, China. I'm not a cartographer, but I don't think Guangzhou, China is directly on the way to Washington, D.C. And one area where we've started to take action in the U.S., but we need to do more, again, following India's lead, is with respect to TikTok. TikTok, as you know, is a wildly popular short-form video application, but it has deep, deep ties ultimately back to the CCP. And India banned TikTok nationwide all the way back in 2020, and it was a really significant decision, and one that I think global regulators need to follow. The track record with TikTok is very, very clear. At first, they represented that no data even exists on U.S. users inside of China, and they maintained that position. And then a report came out about a year and a half ago that got internal TikTok communications, and those communications showed that, quote, everything is seen inside China. And this is by officials that work not just for TikTok, but for ByteDance, and employees that are themselves members of the CCP. And then reports came out that TikTok in the US was using its access to data to surveil the locations of specific Americans, and in fact, it turned out journalists that had been covering and exposing the data flows back into China. TikTok officials came out and they said it wasn't true. They denied it. They said that those stories lacked, in their words, journalistic integrity. But then again, the data came out and it showed, yes, in fact, the TikTok was using surreptitiously access to the application to surveil the location of journalists. We've also seen recently with the incidents of war with Israel responding to the October 7th attacks, and we have seen pro-Hamas content trend in wide margins above and beyond other content in ways that, to me, can only be explained, again, by seeing the ties that go from TikTok to ByteDance back to the CCP. And so I think this is an area where India has really led the world. In the US, we've taken some steps. We've banned TikTok from federal government devices. We have banned it in many cases from state devices. And we're actively considering in the legislature going beyond that and banning TikTok nationwide. It's an action that I wish we had taken in the US sooner. It's progressing more slowly than I would like, but it's not an issue where the FCC has moved on. In fact, our entire national security apparatus, from FBI to CIA to NSA, have all spoken out and raised concerns about the very real security threat posed by TikTok. So I think this is one where I think, Western nations in all countries that are allied around democracy and freedom need to stand together, because the issues we saw with Huawei and ZTE aren't limited to that context. Very similar threats can be posed from TikTok as well. And second, real quick, I want to say another trend that I'm seeing that is interesting to me is sort of a surge in censorship and shutting down free expression on the internet. We've seen it in the US. We have seen instances where it appears in at least 3 different ways. One, we see instances where companies just themselves decide to censor speech or not host speech. We see it in a second way where we see government officials, and happens in the US, where they will call up social media companies and suggest that they take certain content down. And we've seen it in a third way, which is actual affirmative government actions across the globe to censor speech. I think at the end of the day, freedom of expression and increasingly freedom of expression online is fundamental to democracy. And so I hope that we move beyond this sort of spasm of censorship that I think was accelerated with COVID, because we had so many lockdowns and controls that came from COVID that I think censorship rose during COVID. But I hope that now that we're on the other side of that, we see a return both in terms of private companies' embrace of diversity of views, but also government. And in the US, I've advocated for the government officials to be prohibited from calling up social media and suggesting that they censor posts. I've suggested that the companies should disclose when they get those requests from government officials in the US. And I've also said that I think the government should impose what I call our anti-discrimination rules on social media, so that whatever censorship they do, censorship should not be based on political viewpoints, religious viewpoints, or scientific viewpoints. And I hope that we move in that direction, and I do think that we should look to form coalitions around that idea of where there's a serious national security threat demonstrated, like TikTok, we take action. But when it comes to freedom of speech online, we ally around allowing more speech, not less.
Great, Brendan. This is working out excellently. It's as if we planned the order of questions. So, Sunil, I'm going to move to you, and it's even more fluid than I had hoped for, because I think Brendan has raised some really important points in terms of how we balance out some of the varying factors relating to future regulations. So we've heard from numerous speakers about national security concerns. We've now heard about freedom of speech aspects. And then, of course, we have innovation aspects that we want to kind of curate and protect. How do you view all this, work coming from industry, working in public policy, that hands-on aspect? Naturally, you're based here in India. You represent Meta here, a very large market. Would you mind speaking to all of those points for us, and we'll take it from there?
Yeah, happy to do so. Thank you, and thanks for having me. So I wanted to pick up from where Brendan left off, and I thought the most interesting type of censorship that he referenced was the censorship of science, and that is indeed truly worrying, because science has always been done in this open fashion, and I want to tie open science, that concept. Open science today means you will give the source code which you have used to conduct your experiment. You will share the data that you've used under an open data license. You would publish a peer-reviewed academic journal article, and you would make that journal article available under an open access license. So if you bring open source, open data, and open access together, you get open science. I want to connect that collective noun, open science, to the word that was previously discussed, which is public goods. And I want to use the economist's definition rather than any other definition, something that is non-rivalrous and non-excludable. And the only form of digital public goods where there is consensus is free software, open standards, open protocols, etc. This is what economists understand as digital, pure digital public goods. Meta today, my employer, is one of the biggest providers of digital public goods. We have released 650 AI models on GitHub and Hugging Face. We have released 350 open data sets on GitHub. And why is this important? Because we are showing up as allies for India and for every other country on this planet. The point that Basant made about cyber sovereignty. I think that's a very important point. If you were to download Meta's latest blockbuster open source project, Llama 2, you can take the smaller versions of that model and you can install it on your laptop. You can disconnect from the internet and you can query your personal large language model on your private laptop and nobody will know what you're doing with it, in a sense that allows for digital cyber sovereignty at the level of the individual, at the level of the firm, at the level of Indian government entities, and so on. So this is cyber sovereignty at many different levels. You don't have to worry about leaks of personal information, leaks of IP, leaks of confidential information, and you can use your own hardware, and it need not be very expensive hardware. So when we go through various regulatory proposals, I would like us to test those proposals against the open source counterfactual, rather than only look at monolithic proprietary models that are currently ruling discourse. And we've had several proposals. I'll quickly go through them. People have proposed bans on frontier foundational models. People have said that there should be a pause on developing models that are bigger than GPT-4. Others have said that foundational models should be licensed. They're also talking about regulatory obligations on open source developers, not just corporations that release open source products, but all open source developers. What seems quite clear is if you do these things, as Vivek Debroy had pointed out, incumbents will get entrenched. The AI divide, which is the component of the digital divide, will get worse. And there will be no public scrutiny of the risks and also the steps that have been taken to mitigate these risks. And perhaps it is because we are overestimating the impact of AI in the short term, and we are underestimating the impact of AI in the long term. I'm going to use two examples of projects from Meta where this kind of regulatory fever becomes complicated. We have a project called animated drawings. You can take a picture that has been produced by a child and feed it to the model, and the model will animate your child's picture. Could we, for example, say that a model like that doesn't need to be regulated? There is another model that we have released as an open source product, massively multilingual speech. This is based on the self-supervision paradigm. The model is able to identify 4,000 languages and do speech-to-text for 1,100 languages. If you look at the names of the developers on the academic paper that accompanies the code, there are 10 Meta engineers on it. And a claim could be said that how can you 10 Meta engineers who don't speak these 4,000 languages or these 1,000 languages, what right do you have to produce technology like this? I want to tell you about the story of Reverend Ferdinand Kettle, who came to India in the 1800s, produced the first Kannada to English dictionary. He was not a Kannadiga, but he made a seminal contribution to language technology in the 1800s. Similarly, thanks to the power of mathematics, the 10 engineers who don't speak these 1,000 languages can make a tremendous contribution to the lives of people that do speak those languages.
Thank you, Sunil. So I took away a lot from that. I know we're actually perfectly on time, and I really want to move to the floor and have a dynamic conversation. So I hope you are all preparing your thoughts, and we'll take hands in a second. And what I will also do when we take questions is allow, I'm sure Stephanie and Vivek have a lot that they want to kind of respond to from our other three experts. So Neil, interestingly, for those of us in the room, and there are a number of colleagues here who've spent the last decade involved in very hands-on capacity building in various regions. To hear you speak about an AI a divide being even worse or becoming worse than the so-called digital divide in the past is certainly food for thought for the years ahead. Now, of course, we all come from different disciplines, so that jumped out for me. I'm going to open to the floor, and I believe we have colleagues who either you have mics on your tables, or I think there might be mics somewhere in the room. Okay, excellent. So what I will do is, oh, thank you. Sorry, the lights were, it was a bit hard to see. So I'll take three questions at a time, and then allow our panelists to jump in very freely as you feel works fluidly.
Yeah,
so
I'm glad they turned the lights down because it was reflecting off my head and I think it was blinding people, so hopefully you're better off now. Sorry about that.
Fabulous. Okay, so I saw this set of hands here, this there, and please, if you don't mind, introduce yourself when you're asking the question. So 1, 2, and I thought I saw a hand over here. Okay, 3. Actually, I see there are mics here and here, so anybody else, aside from these 3 questions, who wants to ask a question, please stand up. So actually, because you're standing at the mic, we might as well go ahead and then yourself. So please.
All right. My question is for you, Brendan. My name is Fumi Oriagba. I'm the head of procurement at Heineken Ireland. I liked what you said about censorship and freedom of speech. But then my question is, when you've got freedom of speech, it promotes ideas generation and creativity. Sometimes it comes across as witch hunting with the censorship, like TikTok, which you mentioned, although I know you elaborated that it's concerns around security and what have you. But my question is, how do you find the balance such that whilst you're regulating that space and censoring, people are not losing the creativity, innovation, and idea generation that comes with freedom of speech and expression? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. A lot of people ask, how do you reconcile your position on the one hand on TikTok with your sort of, deep embrace of, freedom of expression on the other? And I'd say it comes down to the difference between regulating based on content and regulating based on conduct. And in the TikTok context, it's their conduct, the national security threat, that is the basis for action, not content. Even, for instance, the apparent amplification of pro-Hamas content, we should not regulate that because it is pro-Hamas content, but we should regulate it because it is evidence, combined with other evidence, that there is a link back to the CCP. And so there are very, very difficult edge cases, but we can carve out, child sexual exploitation material. We can carve out, terroristic speech. The hardest cases come when government purports to regulate or to censor in the name of misinformation or disinformation or hate speech. And at the end of the day, too many times politicians define hate speech as speech that they hate, which ends up being political speech. And it's important because if you look through history, freedom of communication over the then modern means of communication has always helped to give power to people over government. So it was pamphlets in the origins of the United States. It was, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, and now it's the internet. When freedom movements happen around the globe right now, people go to the streets first. Second, they take out their phones, they take pictures, they take videos. It can send a spark around the globe. And the next thing that authoritarians do is they shut down the internet. And so that's why we have to be very clear about freedom of expression and not fall prey to using misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech to regulate, ultimately, political speech.
Oh, great. So thank you, Brendan. Before we take your question, I would just like to prepare Stephanie, if you don't mind and you feel comfortable. I would love to hear another perspective to some of Brendan's thoughts on freedom of speech, because I think, in some parts of the world, like Europe, would have a slightly different kind of definitional sense of freedom of speech questions. So if you're comfortable with that, and of course, Vivek, feel free to jump in. And we'll take your question, please, sir. Thank you.
I think that I'm going to follow up on a previous questioner. I'm Paul Cadario. I'm at the University of Toronto Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I'm an American citizen, and I live in Washington, D.C. I'd like to ask Mr. Carr, who is, just for disclosure, a Republican appointee to the FCC.
You didn't have to tell everybody. You ruined it.
Well, I wanted to look it up because I think that's relevant to the comments you made this evening. I don't have TikTok on my phone for the technology reasons that you suggest, because I have colleagues at the Citizen Lab that worry about that. I'm wondering whether you believe that the American First Amendment should apply extraterritoriality, in an extraterritorial way, because certainly Canada bans Holocaust denial. It's in the law. Germany bans Holocaust denial and free speech related to the Nazi Party. Many countries have different views of what is permissible in public, which I think we would call a global public square that social media enables public. And so I'm wondering, well, first, do you believe that the American concepts, in particular with American companies, should be applied worldwide, and if so, why? And should there be a change in administration in the fall, would some of your views, can we expect that some of your views might become part of public policy, which might, shall we say, go in contradiction to fundamentals of the American Constitution? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks much for the question. So, as was indicated, the FCC is 5 commissioners. So right now there's 3 that are always of the president's party. So 3 Democrats, 2 Republicans. I'm the senior Republican, but we get along very, very well at the FCC. I don't think the First Amendment itself should be exported. I think obviously every country is sort of sovereign and comes up with their own definitions. But I do think there is a universal idea that free speech is the counterweight to authoritarianism. And I just think it's a universal value. It's something that should be out there. I think U.S. companies ultimately have to comply with the law in the various countries that they decide to do business in. But I would hope that U.S. companies can continue to embrace, to the largest extent possible, freedom of speech and free expression when they do business in other countries. And I've been critical of a lot of U.S. businesses that operate inside China, because I think they are making some fundamental compromises when it comes to free speech, when it comes to being allied with a government that our own U.S. government has been clear is engaged in genocide. So I think there are some trade-offs, but ultimately I do think that U.S.-based companies should really, really work hard to hew to freedom of speech when they do business anywhere.
So that's fabulous. Stephanie, I would love to hear your thoughts, and anyone else, because certainly, I guess where you're sitting and from your perspectives, most would argue free speech it's not absolute. There's a spectrum and different perspectives. We have a situation in some member states of the EU at the moment where certain multinationals that are based in the United States are now promising, coming to Parliament, parliamentary hearings, and promising to comply with future hate speech legislation. So there is that concern about that sense of compliance and the differences in the jurisdictional differences in how we define free speech or hate speech and so on and so forth. So Stephanie, if you don't mind speaking to some of those aspects, that would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd actually, if we can, be interested in your thoughts well too. So most of my work, so I'm based in Europe, but most of my work has been looking at these issues from perspective mostly within African states as well too. And I think what's interesting is that in a lot of the work we do is we don't actually frame the issue as freedom of speech, but as thinking about trusted, trustworthy, and open information environments. And so I think free speech is a very particular term and slightly particularly loaded. And I think what I want to bring up actually with this too, and it's a bit probably different than what you're thinking, but I think is important as sort of responding to Brendan a bit as well, is this sort of pitching of freedom of speech versus anti-freedom of speech in China doesn't look the same in every country globally in terms of what they experience and what's possible. So if I were to think, for example, of Kenya, where I've done some work, and I'm sure there's people in this room that know a lot more than I do, it's a mix of infrastructure, right? Huawei puts most of the phones. A lot of the telecommunications infrastructure, basic infrastructure, was built by Chinese companies. It's layered then on top of it with American social media platforms. WhatsApp is used by county governments at a local level for basic government functions within it. So you end up with this sort of layered system where some countries are trying to navigate both, and they see both potentially as problematic. Yes, Chinese companies are spying, but also there's censorship from other countries as well too. Censorship is not just it's not a Chinese prerogative. All countries censor in various ways. It's a bigger issue. Second, there isn't the interest of American companies, and I'd love to hear as well your thoughts from Meta's perspective as well. It's familiar to us that a commitment to free speech and a commitment to an open, trusted, trustworthy public sphere is not being implemented the same way everywhere. We know the content moderation issues that have happened in Ethiopia, in Myanmar. that sense that we can't trust the platforms to moderate problematic content everywhere in the same way. What's going to, especially outside of the US context, is something that needs to be considered. And at the same time, sorry, I don't know what else I want to say from there. And at the same time, I think countries are trying to think about, do they have to accept this as a binary choice? And I think India has also placed itself into this conversation in a way to suggest it doesn't have to be a binary choice between China and the US. But countries are already grappling with the fact that they have different layers, different infrastructure that are Chinese, now India as well too, with DPI, and US, and trying to bring them all together. And so I guess, to try and round it up in something that's slightly more coherent, thinking about it from, can we think about these issues from the respective countries that are affected globally? It's a global issue. What is possible in, say, Kenya versus what's possible in the US versus what's possible in China versus what's possible in Chad? It's going to look differently, and I think if we want to think about what good looks like, we need to be thinking about it from those perspectives as well. Sorry, that's a bit long-winded.
No, not at all. No. It's really great to hear from everyone. We have, I'm going to take, we have 2 last questions. We have our last 5 minutes. The time went very quickly, and I know, I believe there is a dinner being served as well. So we'll take the questions, and then please also, if you have any closing remarks or anything you feel you didn't get to cover within the conversation, this is an opportunity to raise it. And we'll start with you, Vivek, after we get those 2 questions, and we'll work our way through. So please. We only have time for 2. I'm so sorry. Thank you.
But we will be here all night.
Sorry?
Thank you. I'm Archit Lohani from the Center of Communication Governance based at the National Law University, Delhi. My question is for all the panelists. There are some key trends which are increasingly evident in South Asia with regards to platform governance regulatory frameworks. There is no representation of multi-stakeholderism, which has been a key component of the DSA, the Digital Services Act of Europe, and the UNESCO guidelines that have come out on multi-stakeholderism, which presents as the best way forward to regulate these platforms. So my question is, how do you think researchers, users, academia, and civil society are best represented in these forums? Because America, United States of America, is struggling to be able to regulate these platforms. At the same time, the Sino-Russian influence of information security and cybersecurity has been conflated in South Asia, and increasingly issues like disinformation are now falling under cybersecurity frameworks, which is again very, very problematic from a censorship point of view, while the resource allocation for these countries which are based in South Asia is much, much lesser, while most users are based out of South Asia. Big companies like Meta are not prioritizing allocating their resources like content moderation and other technological resources they deploy in US elections. How do you feel we are able to best harness this, especially given the AI arms race that we are currently experiencing? Thank you.
Great, and we'll take the second question, and if you don't mind, we'll try and shorten the question, and then we'll jump straight through to the panel. And thank you so much, great questions.
Thank you. My name is Mohammed, I'm from Egypt. So I want to say that when, for example, the Russia war happened, many of the main Western media decided to cancel every opinion coming out of Russia, and that's why, for example, when Tucker Carlson made his interview, it was viewed all over the world. Also, what's happening in Israel now, Israel and Palestinian, the Gaza war. Also, I understand that the United States has an opinion on that. Maybe most of the world think otherwise. You see this in the Security Council, you see this in the General Assembly. But again, the ministry media is tackling that and is trying to mainly stifle the freedom of speech. So how can we not politicize the regulation? We need to regulate the media, but we don't need to politicize the regulations, and it should be open to international standards. So how can we tackle that issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. Okay, great. Vivek, would you like to kick off, and we'll take it from there?
Well, those sounded more like comments rather than questions. And a long question typically warrants a very short answer. So let me touch on some other things. I'm not very sure that freedom of speech is a very good metaphor to use, because that gets us going on a different tangent. In an ideal global world, there would be welfare gains if there were no barriers on cross-border movements of labor and capital. We will never get that ideal world. In an ideal world, there would be welfare gains for the world as a whole if the US were to go completely metric. In an ideal world, there would be welfare gains if power sockets everywhere in the world were the same. That's not going to happen. Exactly similarly, we will never get consensus on what should be the content of regulation, except for basic principles. So I think we come back to the basic question, which is, we expect the government and or the regulator to be omniscient. We have expectations on the part of the government and the regulator which we don't necessarily have on the part of the private sector. So I worry about privacy the moment my data is with the government. I don't worry about privacy when my data is with someone else. The point, of course, is that no regulator is omniscient. And the basic principle is, if I over-regulate, particularly in something like this where technology is changing so very fast, I will stifle innovation. Who tells me, knowing that I am not omniscient, what should be the content of that regulation? Particularly because I do not know how that technology is going to evolve in the future. The problem, of course, is I am told what the content of that regulation should be by existing players. And that is the dilemma for the classic regulator. The absence of information, and there is no getting away from that. And no matter how much we strive for a global consensus, beyond the bare minimum, I don't think we will ever get it. And one example of that is AI.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I've been told time is up. 5 seconds each. Can you just no? Okay. Well, I think we'll hopefully continue the conversation over dinner. So please, everybody, join me in thanking a really great panel. So thank you.
A special thank you to all our panelists in the audience for making this such an invigorating decision. Please enjoy your dinner. Conversations over kava begins at 10:10, so please feel free to make your way to your respective rooms around that time. There will be a photo taken, and I will ask my colleague Basu to present a small token of our appreciation to the panelists.